So the first need that comes to mind stems from the change in the way software is delivered today, right? Change in the way products and applications are delivered to users today. At one point, the best way to deliver software used to be you ship a bunch of DVDs and somebody pops them in and installs the software, right? Today, almost every piece of software we use just gets what's called as over-the-air streaming, right? It just gets delivered to you as bits over the internet, whether it's the first time you install a piece of software or anytime there is an update to the piece of software. And that kind of means that especially if you're a B2C, a business to consumer company, your application or your product, the audience is the entire world, or at least the connected part of the world, about 4 billion or so people today. And as you can see, that's why maybe some of these numbers are not surprising at all. There are about 3.5 billion Google searches that happen every day, a day. YouTube streams about 1 billion hours of video across the globe every day. And Facebook has some very similar numbers. The total number of photos indexed by Facebook today, as of nearly as of day, is about 250 billion. And that number, by the way, grows by about 300 million new photos being uploaded by users every day. So as you can see that these applications, of course, are like sort of the top ranked applications that the world uses in some ways. But even if your product or application was a modest, call it a modest, fraction of this, you're still talking about potentially millions of users across the web. And you're talking about the kind of infrastructure that you're going to need to run your application at a comparable scale at some point. The Netflix one is interesting too, because of the peak internet traffic usage in the US, 37% of the traffic is just Netflix streaming, which was sort of really stood out for me as where people are spending time on as well in terms of consuming these apps and services today. So it may mean that you need infrastructure of the magnitude of something like this to run your application. On the left, what you see is one of Google's production servers. And of course, a rack like this isn't enough. A rack essentially is a collection of these boards, as you can see, the blades or the rack servers. They have a disk attached to them. They have a network attached to them. And they are essentially running bits of the software and working in a concerted way. And as you can see, a typical picture inside a data center is rows and rows of these racks, sometimes about anywhere between a few hundred to sometimes a couple of thousand racks as well in a large data center. And that kind of ends up in a monstrosity like this. This is Facebook's data center based out of Sweden. It's about the size of 6 football fields. This is, things that we take for granted every day, right? A quick Google search or uploading your latest, holiday pictures on Facebook. There is a tremendous amount of engineering that actually goes under the covers to make it happen. This also means that it takes close to $1 billion in investment or more. And what's interesting is that data centers like these consume a phenomenal amount of power as well. I mean, something to the order of about 50 megawatts of power, almost the amount of power that a small town would possibly consume, is consumed by a single data center. They also tend to, because they consume so much power, they also tend to dissipate a lot of heat. And increasingly, many of the data center companies are starting to build data centers in colder regions of the world, so that there's a natural sort of heat dissipation they can take benefit from. So this one, for example, this data center of Facebook is about 70 miles from the Arctic Circle. Here is another example of a Google data center in Finland that's actually just off the Bay of Finland. So they are able to pull in the cold water from the Bay of Finland and use that for cooling the data center, right? Cooling, managing the heat dissipation, managing the temperatures within the data center. And that's really what is the price you pay for running, sort of compute at this size and scale. So there are a few takeaways here, right? One, it costs a lot more in terms of upfront cost investments. Two, it's going to take you possibly months, possibly years to establish infrastructure like this. If you are one of those lucky few products or applications that have really scaled on the internet today. But that's not the only problem you're dealing with. Here is another interesting problem that comes up every year in the e-commerce space. So the e-commerce sort of sways a lot based on the shopping season in the US. These are US numbers. And especially as we go past the month of November, towards the end of November, past the Thanksgiving season, there is this entire hype created around retail. So brands are doing great deals, great discounts. And so people, for the most part, sometimes even wait for the holiday shopping season to start. And as you can see in the chart right here, the x-axis is the month of November, the days in November, from the first to the end. And the y-axis is the sales volume, the number of orders. You could see that most of November has been a fairly steady state demand. But as you roll into what's called as the Black Friday, the Friday after Thanksgiving, when the where the shopping season kicks off, and the Monday after that, which is called the Cyber Monday, which is where you find some great deals on electronic products and things like that. The overall orders, the demand, the traffic suddenly surges. And we are not talking just about like a 10, 20, 50% surge in traffic. This is almost a 4 or a 5x surge in traffic. So for example, on an average day, the aggregate online retail revenue in the US is about $1.4 billion. And on a Black Friday, that jumps to about $6 billion. What this means is it's also, if the retailers are not ready, if the e-commerce platforms are not ready, and say for whatever reason you can't take this amount of traffic, this is lost opportunity. As a retailer, you're probably going to make a good 25-30% of your revenue in just those few weeks of the year. And if your, call it application, right, your e-commerce platform application is not ready to take this spike, you're potentially looking at millions or billions of dollars of lost opportunity, lost revenue here from customers. Here is a couple of other examples as well, where you can almost not anticipate traffic spikes sometimes. On the left is a very recent reference. New York Times did an op-ed about how coronavirus has actually changed the way we use the internet today. So February 29th, the first COVID-19 death was reported in the US. And just look at the pattern of traffic on some of these sites, Facebook, Netflix, and YouTube. It started sharply, it started a very sharp upward trend. Obvious, because people were social distancing, people were spending more time at home, and they needed ways to entertain themselves and to socially connect in virtual ways. And you would see this traffic pattern with many, many other providers as well, whether it's Zoom, whether it's some of these enterprise collaboration tools and so on, which also is something that couldn't necessarily have been anticipated. If you were a Facebook or you were a application service provider, it's not something you can always anticipate. Let's look at the chart on the right as well. This is something called the flash crowd effect, or the Slashdot effect, as it used to be called at one point. If your site or your product gets tweeted, and say especially if it's a celebrity who is talking about your product, and it gets retweeted and retweeted over and over again, What happens is it causes this viral kind of a snowball effect. Um, this is almost like Apple announcing, say, a new Apple Watch. You would see that the Apple site receives a surge of traffic, for a few days later after that, right? Um, or there are numerous examples of this. This could be a world event that happened, and the content you have on your site becomes suddenly very relevant. So as you can see here, for the most part, the site traffic was pretty quiescent in nature. The x-axis here is a progression of days and time. The y-axis is requests per second. It's not a whole lot, but from a quiescent state, there was a sudden traffic surge that happened here. There also used to be a very interesting pattern to this. You see a first surge when Europe latches on to, say, a link that gets reshared a lot of times, and then kind of the traffic trails off. And then by the time the US East Coast comes up, there is another surge of traffic that comes as well. So there's kind of this double peak effect, or sometimes even a triple peak effect, because by the time extreme east of Asia or say Australia comes up, there is another peak that comes your way as well. So the question we are staring at here is not only do I need large infrastructure to scale, but I cannot predict how much infrastructure I'm going to need to support these kinds of traffic spikes. And that kind of leads us to the idea of demand elasticity, right? Demand elasticity, and hence the elasticity of the compute infrastructure that you need as well. Now, this is my there's probably several other reasons why people move to the cloud, but this also is one of my favorites. Let's look at this quote from Jeff Dean. Some of you who may be following Google closely, Jeff Dean is the head of artificial intelligence at Google. He's been a long time Google fellow, and he's also been someone really responsible for the massive scale at which the company has expanded in the last 15-20 years. He was responsible for a lot of data center operations and so on at Google. And it's fascinating to read this. He's talking about in each cluster, so he's talking about a cluster of computers. In each cluster's first year, it's typical that 1,000 individual machine failures will occur. Thousands of hard drive failures will occur. A power distribution unit will fail, and so on and so forth. There's a 50% chance that the cluster will overheat. So my first reaction reading this was, these guys are supposed to be the best engineering minds in the world. How is it that their data centers are sort of, have this rampant slew of failures after failures, and why are they so openly talking about this? So then you begin to realize that at a scale like that, failure actually is the norm, and it's not really an exception. If you want to kind of if you want to establish a little bit further this thought a little bit further along, look at the chart on the right. So it plots what's called as the annualized failure rates of hard drives. Right, the hard drives all of us have in our computers, more or less. Some of them magnetic, now some of them solid state. This data has come from a cloud provider called Blackblaze. Blackblaze is a online cloud storage service. You could essentially rent small and large amounts of cloud storage from them. And they, in their data centers, they obviously babysit a lot of hard drives, right? They have hundreds of thousands of hard drives in their data centers backing up that storage. And as you can see, the failure rates, the annualized failure rates for hard drives has been somewhere in the 1% range. It also depends on the age of the drive. So typically, when you have new piece of equipment, there tends to be a slightly higher failure rate because of manufacturing variances and things like that, right? So something that's called as infant mortality of new equipment. But after that, it kind of reaches a steady state for a few years, and then the aging process starts. So the annualized failure rates, let's assume that we are being optimistic that the annualized failure rate is just a meager 1%. It's a pretty low number. But if you're talking about a data center with 100,000 hard drives, you are looking at about 1,000 failures of hard drives a year. And again, I mean, this is just math, right? You can't beat it. Um, and this is only hard drives. So compound that with power units, compound that with networking equipment, compound that with maybe your CPUs and motherboards and your blade servers and all of that together, right? So you can quickly see that this can get out of hand. And for enterprises who have been running their own data centers for many years, they realize that, oh, we are investing all this time and effort and money trying to manage this, manage the operational parts of this, uh, that it's not really our core focus. This is not our core. Uh, this is not core value creation for us as a business, right? And that's why this term called undifferentiated heavy lifting. You're spending a lot of time and effort on things that don't directly add value to your business. And so when you encounter problems that you can't solve well enough, one answer to that is, well, why don't you outsource the problem to the experts? So again, the problem like this is the genesis of why this idea of cloud service providers started emerging.